Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie ganz, ganz herzlich begrüßen hier im KörberForum. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie trotz des mäßigen Hamburger Novemberwetters den Weg hier zu uns gefunden haben. Schön, dass Sie da sind. Wir haben heute ein sehr aktuelles, aber auch ein sehr schwieriges Thema auf der Agenda. Wir wollen heute über Syrien diskutieren. Wir sind alle fassungslos angesichts der Gewalt, die uns jeden Tag über die Medien erreicht. Und wir haben den Eindruck, die Situation in Syrien wird jeden Tag schlimmer, nicht besser. Der Syrien-Beauftragte der Vereinten Nationen, Lakhdar Brahimi, hat inzwischen sogar von einer Somalisierung der Situation in Syrien gesprochen. Das heißt, das, was in Syrien passiert, wird der Situation in Somalia von Tag zu Tag ähnlicher. Die Frage, die wir uns alle stellen, ist, kann es angesichts dieser Lage überhaupt noch eine politische Lösung geben? Und wenn nein, was ist die Alternative dazu? Die internationale Gemeinschaft scheint dazu keine schlüssige Antwort zu haben und sie ist in der Syrien-Frage mindestens so uneins, wie das die syrische Opposition ist. Und dann sind da noch die regionalen Akteure, dazu würde ich Saudi-Arabien, Iran und die Golfstaaten zählen, die in Syrien alle ihr eigenes Süppchen kochen und Interessen verfolgen, die nicht notwendigerweise mit dem konform gehen, was für die Menschen in Syrien das Beste wäre. Das ist der Hintergrund, vor dem wir heute diskutieren wollen, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Wir wollen heute darüber sprechen, wie es weitergehen kann in Syrien, was zu tun ist, um der Gewalt ein Ende zu bereiten und welche Vorbereitungen getroffen werden können für die Zeit nach einem möglichen Sturz des Assad-Regimes. Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir ein wunderbares Panel haben, um diese Fragen heute zu diskutieren. Ich möchte unsere Gäste ganz herzlich begrüßen und sie Ihnen kurz vorstellen. Ich beginne mit der Dame in der Runde, Rafif Jouejati. Sie ist seit langem engagiert für mehr Demokratie und mehr Rechtsstaatlichkeit in Syrien. Seit Beginn des Aufstandes 2011 engagiert sie sich aktiv für die syrische Opposition. Sie ist Sprecherin der lokalen Koordinationskomitees. Vielleicht haben Sie diesen Begriff schon mal in den Medien gehört. Das sind Einheiten, die den zivilen Widerstand in Syrien organisieren. Was ich persönlich ganz besonders sympathisch an Rafif Jouejati finde, ist, dass sie trotz der schlimmen Dinge, die in Syrien passieren, sich immer noch einen großen Optimismus und einen großen Enthusiasmus bewahrt hat. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass Rafif heute bei uns ist. Herzlich willkommen. Der zweite im Bunde ist Rainer Hermann. Rainer Hermann ist, wenn man das so sagen kann, der Mr. Middle East der Frankfurter Allgemeinen Zeitung. Er hat für die FAZ unter anderem aus Istanbul und aus Abu Dhabi berichtet. Und er hat eine ganz besondere Gabe. Er versteht es nämlich, die komplexe Welt des Nahen Ostens für den Leser sehr anschaulich und sehr verständlich darzustellen. Herr Hermann berichtet im Moment aus der Hauptredaktion der FAZ in Frankfurt, nicht in Frankreich, über den Nahen Osten. Er hat sich intensiv mit den Ereignissen in Syrien beschäftigt und er ist ein perfekter Gesprächspartner für Rafif Jouejati. Herr Hermann, auch Ihnen ein ganz herzliches Willkommen. Meine Damen und Herren, was wäre die spannendste Diskussion ohne einen guten Moderator? Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir einen solchen gefunden haben für den heutigen Abend. Ich begrüße ganz herzlich Jan Kuhlmann. Jan Kuhlmann ist freier Journalist, er lebt in Berlin. Auch er beschäftigt sich seit langer Zeit mit dem Nahen und Mittleren Osten, kennt die Region wie seine eigene Westentasche. Er hat mir erzählt, dass er eigentlich auf dem Sprung nach Basra im Irak ist, aber heute Abend ist er hier bei uns in Hamburg. Auch Ihnen, Herr Kuhlmann, ein ganz, ganz herzliches Willkommen. Meine Damen und Herren, jetzt bleibt mir eigentlich nur noch Ihnen allen einen interessanten Abend zu wünschen, mit vielen neuen Einblicken, Eindrücken. Noch einmal ganz herzlich willkommen und unsere Akteure würde ich jetzt auf die Bühne bitten.
Yes, I would like to say also good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to have you here, and I'm very happy to have these interesting guests next to me, Ms. Rafif Jouejati, Dr. Hermann. And I think I can also say on behalf of the both that it's a pleasure and an honor for us to be here to discuss also with you. We will have a Q&A later to discuss also with you the situation in Syria. And I think it's a very important topic we are dealing with tonight. Talking about Syria means also talking about a country which has for a very, very long time a very strong relationship with Europe and also with Germans. You can go back to the Romans and you will see that there was always a very strong political, cultural, economical exchange between Syria and Europe. Syria is a wonderful country. It attracts a lot of Europeans, a lot of visitors used to travel there. And I can say if you haven't been there and in case, and we all hope that this is going to happen, in case the conflict is over, I only can recommend you to travel there. You will find fantastic places like Damascus, Aleppo, or Palmyra, for example. And not to forget that it were the Europeans who created modern Syria after World War I when they decided to divide the whole area. Nowadays, Syria is of great strategic importance. We have the axis between Iran, Syria, and the Hezbollah. I don't want to call it axis of evil because someone else used to create this. But if you talk about Iran and if you talk about keeping Iran from getting nuclear weapons, you also have to talk about Syria, because if Assad falls, Iran will lose a very important partner. And I think we can also say that we won't have any kind of solution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians if Syria is not involved. So we won't have no stability in the region without Syria. And last but not least, I can say that we have something like a strong democratic movement in the region, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, in other countries. If Assad really falls down, that would give this democratic movement new power. And we can also say if Assad remains in power, that would be something like a setback for the democratic movements. So there are many reasons to talk about Syria. We have real experts here next to me. And it's a good time to talk about Syria because at least I think we can say that the latest events show some kind of indication that there might be a change to the better of the situation. We have the talks of the opposition in Doha in the last days. We have many different opposition groups. Dr. Hermann, why has the Syrian opposition failed up to now to unite and just to have something like a big umbrella organization?
Well, there is no culture of cooperation. There is no address you could phone and you could ask to do something together. Doha is certainly a small step forward to overcome this disintegration. There is a disconnect between the opposition in exile, until now the Syrian National Council, and the opposition and, for example, local coordination councils within Syria. And there are too many different interests, visions, and visions for the future of Syria that until now it was not possible. And the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, therefore said very reasonable, the Syrian National Council is not a visible leader of the opposition. Something new must be created. And I hope that Doha will be more than just a small step to unify the opposition.
I'd like to add to that. First, please. I want to thank the Körber Foundation and everybody for coming out tonight. Another problem with the Syrian opposition thus far is that we have to remember that Syrians have been under single-party domination for more than 50 years. And during 50 years of repression, there has been no opportunity to form legitimate opposition groups or express one's political views freely. And so we are new to revolution and we are new to political discourse. So while yes, the Syrian National Council has been rather dysfunctional. I think this is apparent to anybody following the revolution. We must also admit that Syrians are new to this, and it has been an intense learning process. I think we have a lot of optimism for the new Syrian Transitional Initiative that's being announced, and look forward to seeing the results of the Doha meetings.
You say that well, it's a new situation for the opposition, but I mean, the conflict has been going on for quite a while, and the opposition in Syria has a kind of history. It's not that you had to start from one day to another. I mean, all the figures, the leading figures within the opposition are very well known, at least among Syrians. So why have you failed at least to find something like a common aim to topple Assad? I mean, even this is not a common position among all the opposition groups.
Oh, I don't know if I would agree with that necessarily. One thing has been very, very clear from the beginning of the revolution. Everybody who is involved in the opposition wants to see Assad gone. This has been unanimous among opposition figures. The other point that is unanimous among opposition figures is that we want to transition to a democratic, secular, pluralistic state. This, again, has been agreed upon by all parties in the opposition. It is really the how we plan to get there that may be with differences.
Mm-hmm. I would like to talk a little bit about the Syrian National Council, which is the most important organization of the opposition. You, as member of the local coordination committees, LCC, you're also a member of the SNC. Mm-hmm. Dr. Rainer Hermann has mentioned it, that Hillary Clinton said the SNC has outlived its usefulness and should be replaced.
Must be replaced.
Or must be replaced. I could imagine that you disagree with Ms. Clinton. What's the position of the SNC?
Well, the SNC has, in my view, failed to take the necessary steps that would lead to the formation of a transitional government, that would lead Syrians to offer an alternative to Assad. I think the great fears among all nations is that you cannot simply topple a regime and have no one to take its place. The Syrian National Council was not, I think Dr. Hermann said it, or perhaps you did, was not in close enough contact with opposition figures on the ground, and this includes the local coordination committees. Now, the LCC is a member of the SNC because we cannot be ignored. We are the largest activist network on the ground. But I don't think the SNC made the type of progress everybody in the opposition was hoping for. Now, with respect to Secretary Clinton's comments, I believe they are well placed, but the LCC and Syrians in general are not looking for Secretary Clinton to tell them when to replace their councils and what should take their place.
Do you think it could be something like counterproductive?
I would like to think that the intentions were good. I believe this was an attempt to be helpful, but perhaps the words she selected were inappropriate. We immediately felt that we were being dictated to, and this was not acceptable to at least the local coordination committees and many of those youth activists who are getting killed every day and their families.
I would like to step in 2 points. Well,
please.
Mrs. Clinton was right that the Americans and the West, and probably also most of the Syrians, lost patience, because it was the SNC was reduced to a club of people who want to grasp power, but who are not able to overthrow Assad. It was a coalition of coalitions, but it was not representing all in the opposition. It was mainly a club of Sunnis, Muslim Brotherhood is strong, but many people on the ground and also outside this Sunni mainstream are excluded. So now it is time to bring them in, to have a unified political structure. So in case Assad is toppled, and I hope that will be the case rather sooner than later, that we have an institution, that we have some people who can fill the vacuum. It is necessary to bring about this unification of the opposition, which was not the case And this is a difference to Libya. Why Libya? This is until now an enigma for me. Why Libya succeeded in creating a unified opposition and government in exile, which was able to bring the recognition of the international community in order as a condition to overthrow, to topple Gaddafi. This is not the case in Syria, and it's an enigma for me until now why for Syrians, which have a higher degree of education than the Libyans, why they do not come together.
If you're following the SNC from a distance, at least, you sometimes have the impression that the leading figures within the SNC are more interested in the personal career than in Syria and the future of Syria. Could this be an explanation?
Well, they had been surprised by the development in Syria, and there are very reasonable opposition leaders. Riyad Saif, whom I know since 30 years, he is very credible in unifying these people. And therefore, I hope this is more than a small step in Doha. If a credible figure like Riyad Saif is leading the Syrian opposition, that he might gather the opposition and lead them to a conference of the Friends of Syria in Morocco, where the United States might re-engage and might be convinced that this is an organization first for political context negotiations with the regimes. They will fail, but then you have an institutions through which you can channel weapons. So the conference in Morocco, which will take place if the conference in Doha is successful, might be then a trigger of change in Syria.
Let's go back to a couple of points.
Please.
The Libyan NTC was a much smaller body, and perhaps this can explain some of the problems in Syria. I don't doubt that there is some competition between personal egos in political positions and the genuine desire to effect change in Syria. But Dr. Hermann, you said a very key word, and I must object. You said negotiations with the regime. And I can tell you that absolutely not. The Syrian opposition will not enter into negotiations with Assad or his representatives. And perhaps you didn't mean that, but that is...
I think this is the condition in order to bring the Russians and the Chinese on the boat. If you say, well, first we start with the Syrians, with the regime, knowing that it will fail, then you have the Russians on the board, and then it's easier to continue the process.
The Syrian opposition will not entertain negotiations with the people's executioner. After more than 33,000 people dead, close to 3 million internally displaced people, close to maybe 300,000 refugees in neighboring countries, untold numbers of people in forced and illegal detention. These are prisoners of conscience. When the regime is targeting small children and women and using rape as a tool of sexualized torture, there can be no negotiations with this regime.
I would like to talk about a possible solution of the crisis later. I would like to stick with the question, who is the opposition and who's strong in the opposition? Rainer Hermann mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is always said that the SNC in the end is a tool of the Muslim Brotherhood. How strong is the Muslim Brotherhood really within the SNC?
Within the SNC, I believe the Muslim Brotherhood has exerted undue influence. I don't believe the Muslim Brotherhood is representative of mainstream Syrians. Syrians inside certainly are very devout in their respective religions. You know that Syria is a mosaic of religions and cultures. Certainly people are quite devout, but they are essentially secular. And I believe the Muslim Brotherhood does not enjoy the popularity it wishes it did. So they exerted undue influence.
How can you be sure about this?
We have a history with the Muslim Brotherhood. Many Syrians blame the Muslim Brotherhood for the massacre in Hama of 1982, when Assad the Elder essentially crushed the city of Hama within a 2-week period and killed as many as 40,000 people. There is a lot of negativity towards the Muslim Brotherhood, and Syrians, for the most part, wish to practice their religions freely and not hamper people's ability or right to practice other beliefs.
Is this a position of the, let's say, secular opposition to calm down the West who's scared of the Muslim Brotherhood? Are they really as weak as Rafif Jouejati says? What do you think about it?
Well, I have seen posters when I was in Syria saying, well, we, the non-Muslim Brotherhood, excuse for not having participated in 1982 uprising. Otherwise, maybe we could have toppled Assad, Hafez al-Assad then. It's still a mystery how strong the Muslim Brotherhood is inside and outside. What we cannot neglect is the rise in Salafi thinking among the opposition and among the armed opposition among the rebels. And this is a result of the failure of bringing about a political solution by peaceful demonstration. People turn to weapons, and then the Salafi string, which is supported by the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others, offers easy solution. They show legitimacy. They show, they say, well, we defend the Sunni majority against the Alawi minority, and they have an easy recipe, an easy understood recipe to those underprivileged, which are the, let's say, the flag bearers of the revolution, of these young people unemployed in the suburbs of Damascus, in the suburbs of Aleppo, in the provinces. All revolutions in Syria started from the rural areas. And so these Salafis preach to these young people, young Sunnis, which have not benefited from the economic boom in Syria in the past 10 years. We had growth rates from 5 to 6% every year, but they did not get any job. And so it is them who these Salafi preachers who are broadcasting from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, and also from Kuwait, whom they are addressing, and they find more and more followers. And this is what scares me.
Rafif Jouejati, it's hard to say from the distance from abroad how strong the Salafi movements are really within Syria. How do you assess the danger of the Salafis undermining the Syrian opposition and undermining something like democratic change in Syria?
Certainly, it's a concern for all of us who are secularists, who are not conservative maybe in any particular way. But I think we need to distinguish between those who are Salafis by belief and those who are using religion to further a political agenda, and yet those parasitic types who will be attracted to chaos and who will further their missions. In Syria, I don't believe those who practiced conservatively had a political agenda. For many of the youth who are turning more and more to conservative Islam, I believe it is because there's a vacuum in education and there are no alternatives. The other point is when you see the missile coming down to your village, you are often tempted to say, oh my God, and you are often tempted to look a little bit more introspectively and question the meaning of existence. And I think this has happened to tremendous pockets of the population. Notwithstanding, I believe that the largest opposition forces continue to be secular.
Mm-hmm. I would say that the majority of the people in Germany or in the West altogether is supporting the Syrian opposition. And sometimes we tend to have something like a black and white picture of what's going on in Syria. So we have the good opposition and we have the bad Assad regime. And if you're looking closer at what's happening in Syria, you can see that it's not black and white, but that there are a lot of something like gray tones. And you can see this if you're looking at what kind of violence is happening in Syria. We had, for example, the massacre in Hula. It was at the 25th of May, when something like 108 people were killed in Hula. It's close to Homs. 34 women, 49 children, innocent people, which actually had nothing to do with the conflict. And we had different reports about who was behind Hula. And you have written an article about it, which find a lot of attraction in the whole world. What is your analysis of what happened in Hula?
First of all, there is a story and a history of massacres. Let's just remind 1997 Ben Talha, Algeria, when the military staged a massacre at this village and blamed it on the Islamists just to discredit them. 2 years later, Rajak, 45 Kosovo Albanians killed by whom? The result was that this triggered the foreign military intervention, which toppled at the end Milosevic. So massacres have the capability to trigger action, to shape public opinion. And this is, well, what first came to my mind when I was hearing the story of Hula, because the same night, when that was a Friday, 25th of May, the same night, the Syrian National Council applied to the United Nations, now it's time, this is the proof. And the next Monday, there was a very important United Nations Security Council meeting debating the fate of Syria. So this had been two factors why I believed it would be to the detriment of the regime if they would do it. Well, I started in Syria 30 years ago, and my contacts, my friends, date back to that time. And when I was in the beginning of June in Syria and talked to these people, opposition, but Al-Mu'arad al-Wataniya, the nationalist opposition, which does not cooperate with the Syrian National Council, center-left. When I told them, when I asked them, what do you believe about, think about Hula, they told me, we have very interesting guests from Hula, come to our home. And then they told me what I find convincing. I don't claim to have the truth. I think truth is the first thing to be the first victim of war. But I did not find it convincing the official reports which had been published, for example, by the Pinheiro Commission. Even the Pinheiro Commission argued there is reasonable evidence to believe. They did not say there is evidence that we do know. And so what my research showed is there had been two phases. One phase at 2 o'clock, the fight between the regular army and the Free Syrian Army at a checkpoint south of Taldo, the main city of Hula, which had some shelling and destruction of Taldo. And then after 5 o'clock, the massacre started, not by shelling, but by knives, by close-up pistols. What I asked for is, why is there no forensic evidence, as we had in Rajak, where we could argue the forensic evidence shows that these people had been killed this way, and that excludes, for example, that these perpetrators had done it. So the two eyewitnesses from Hula I spoke to argued the people killed had been the representatives of Taldo, and they had been unwilling to donate to the Free Syrian Army, and therefore people within Taldo took the lawlessness of the situation as an opportunity to settle these accounts. This is what they tell me. It might not be the truth. I find it more convincing than the other version.
So your conclusion is, just to say it in a short sentence, your conclusion is that in the end, probably, or there's some kind of indication that not any kind of government-affiliated forces were behind the massacre, but some kind of people affiliated to the opposition.
If it is true that the people killed had been the representatives of the regime, and that they had been unwilling to donate to the Free Syrian Army, I find it convincing that the regime could not have done it.
Yeah. I think that you have a different opinion
I have
about
a
it.
completely different opinion because every day we see massacres in Syria. This morning there was one in a Damascus suburb. Several weeks ago you may have heard about the Dareya massacre, in which more than 600 people were killed in a single day. The typical regime scenario is that they first cut communications, electricity, and water to an area. Then they begin launching artillery and mortars, and then they send in the shabiha, their armed thugs, their mafia men, who go in with knives and whatever weapons they carry, and they kill and rape at random. These are the people with the power. In the case of Hula, after your article came out, sir, a council of the people of Homs immediately published a statement completely repudiating your article, and following that, I believe Der Spiegel sent a group of reporters to Hule and interviewed 7 families who were residents, and they all testified that they had never been contacted by anybody on your team. So there is a lot of disagreement. Now, I don't claim that the armed opposition has not committed its own atrocities, and I don't condone them, but please, give the dead their due, and when we know that the regime and its supporters went in to kill innocents, let us please assign the blame very squarely where it belongs.
There are many massacres, and this is the very bloody side of the conflict. And for a reporter, it is very, very difficult under these circumstances to report what really happens on the ground. There are many videos on display, but it is very difficult to verify from whom do they come from, what do they show, have they been manipulated or not. But well, the way there is a marketing of massacres. For example, Tremse, where also was reporting on the 12th of July. The Syrian National Council first reported there was a massacre of 200 people in the village of Tremse, and then the day after, the United Nations reported no, it was not a massacre; it was just an ordinary battle between the regular army and the armed opposition.
One of the functions of the local coordination committees in Syria is to document the Assad crimes against humanity. And let me tell you how many activists we have had to replace because the mere act of investigating and collecting forensic evidence is punishable by detention or death. And so it is almost impossible to maintain the same investigators. And so every day after a killing, we verify the names, we verify with family members, we contact eyewitnesses for corroborating evidence. It is a propaganda machine that we're seeing with the regime because it controls the media in the country. It does not allow foreign journalists to come in at will. If you, sir, went to Syria, you would have gone through an extensive visa application process, and you would have had a government minder either with you at all times or watching you very carefully. So we can safely say there is no free media, and we can safely say that any sort of documentation is an extremely dangerous proposition.
I know that I move around quite freely, at least within Damascus, and know how to get rid of them. Inside Damascus, outside I didn't travel.
When you were in Syria, were you allowed to leave Damascus? Were you allowed to go to any other places?
I was traveling very frequently in the suburbs of Damascus, such as Harasta and Douma, and this was enough to work for me. I did not decide to travel somewhere else in June.
How is your experience with the Syrian government? How did they try to influence you, and if so?
I thought they tried this the last time in June. They tried much less to influence me because, well, before they always really had a mind. I had a program, and then they tell me, well, if you know the city, you know the country, go ahead. We don't have people enough people to send with the foreign journalists.
But you were allowed, I mean, if you would have liked, you could have left Damascus, you could have gone to any other place in Syria? Because it is always said that foreign journalists are not allowed to go to the country.
It's dangerous. It's dangerous, of course.
Of course, it's dangerous because it's a violent crisis, but you were allowed to go to Syria and you were allowed to go to any place of your choice, actually.
You're one of very few exceptions, because Marie Colvin was actually killed in Syria, in Homs, as were several European journalists who went to cover. People filming protests or filming other demonstrations have been targeted because they are there to cover. Certainly a select few have been allowed in and have been allowed to report. We cannot forget the famous Barbara Walters interview with Bashar al-Assad, for example. So yes, there are few, but nonetheless, reporting is dangerous, can make you a target for the regime, as we've seen with many of your colleagues.
I know Damascus well, and therefore I stayed there. I don't know Homs. I passed through several times, but since therefore I did not go there.
I think if we're talking about Syria, we should ask the question: what are we actually talking about, and what is this conflict? In your articles, you used the word civil war. Is it a civil war we are seeing in Syria?
Yes, it is a civil war, because everyone is fighting for survival. The Sunnis are killing the Alawis and vice versa. There's a war between battles between Kurds and Arabs. The most recently, in the past week, a major Kurdish female leader in Aleppo was killed or not killed down. The conflicting reports. Then rich people are kidnapped, and there is looting. So, well, it is a situation of lawlessness, and lawlessness just is a conducive environment for civil war. Of course, it is also a war of annihilation by the regime, and let's not forget it, the regimes started with the violence, because in the beginning the demonstration had been peaceful. And only after the peaceful demonstrators realized that they will not go anywhere, they started to go for the weapons. We have violence on all sides. It is a war of annihilation, but it is also a civil war.
If we talk about a civil war, it means something. It means something, for example, for the international community, because if you have a civil war, it's much harder to interfere, to have something like, let's say, military intervention. Do you agree that it's a civil war, what we see?
No, I do not. The strict legal definition of civil war is provided by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And for a conflict to qualify as a civil war, the opposition army must control large areas of territory by ground and by land. Civil war often connotes a sectarian conflict, and this is not the case in Syria. Any sectarian problems have been an instrumental part of the regime's narrative in trying to pit Sunnis against Kurds or Christians against Druze. Again, I said it is a melting pot of cultures and religious affiliations. What we have is a case of genocide, now that the regime is specifically targeting and displacing children. It qualifies as genocide. This conflict is a situation where the government is waging war against its own people, that the opposition or parts of the opposition became militarized was a function of the need for self-defense. Syrians inside felt that nobody was coming to help them, and they picked up weapons. Any nation, any people, any village will do the same when they are attacked. Today, what we have is the regime using MiGs to launch the bombs and dropping barrel bombs from attack helicopters. The barrel bombs are filled with TNT, bits of metal, and fuel, so that when they impact, they cause maximum damage. What is being targeted are civilian communities, not just armed opposition strongholds, but civilian communities. This, I believe, does not qualify it as a civil war. I believe this makes it a genocide.
Yeah, but you also have to mention that on the opposition side, there are some forces which uses means which are not accepted at all. Like, for example, suicide bombings. We had these suicide attacks in Damascus, for example.
We have had a series of events perpetrated by members of the armed opposition. We don't deny this, and a crime is a crime, and to us, everybody must be held accountable for their crimes. But there are a couple of things. There have been many instances of booby-trapped cars exploding at different ministries or at different intelligence headquarters, and they were found to be regime plants. There was one instance in Mezzeh in Damascus where a building was attacked, and what we found were that the casualties, the dead as a result of this bombing, were actually prisoners. It was on a Monday morning. It was during rush hour when people were supposed to be going to work or to school or whatever they do on a Monday morning, and the majority of the victims were actually in their underwear. These were prisoners who were brought out, who had either been killed before the explosion or were killed during the explosion. So we see a lot of acts perpetrated by the regime and blamed on the opposition. And again, this is not to condone any acts perpetrated by the armed opposition. Certainly, we have instances of those. But we cannot ever compare the level of violence of the armed opposition with the level of violence committed by the regime.
I would be happy if I could agree with you. Well, of course, there is the violence committed by the regime. There is violence committed by armed opposition. But in between, there are many groups who arm themselves in order to defend themselves. Be it, for example, the Christians of Aleppo. They do not take sides. Most of them just want to have a prosperous life and are afraid to live in a failed state, and therefore they had been, until very recently at least, a silent majority within the Christian community. Or look at the Alawis. The Alawis, there's a combination of memory and fear, the memory of being persecuted in history, because, well, if you talk about Salafi and the Sunni influence on the opposition, then the medieval scholar Ibn Taymiyyah comes to your mind, who has argued in a fatwa it is very positive, very good for a Sunni Muslim to kill an Alawi. That elevates him directly to paradise. And so the Alawi community is organizing themselves in gangs, and the Shabiha, the ruthlessness of the Shabiha, also can be explained by the fear of the Alawi. So if you want to reduce the threat of the Shabiha, just take from the Alawis the fear that they will be annihilated by followers of Ibn Taymiyyah.
I have to respond to this. Certainly within the Alawi community, there is a lot of fear, absolutely. The Alawi community has had this fear instilled in them since Hafez al-Assad took over power in 1969. Because it is a minority rule, the fear has always been implanted in villages to say, if we do not rule, we will be killed. I know several Alawis in the opposition who understand this mind game the regime has played for now 42, 43 years. Certainly, there are extremists who are ready to take revenge and kill Alawis. I am very happy to report that in Aleppo in particular, when regime forces tried to distribute weapons, many Christians and Alawis refused to take up arms. They said, we are Syrian, we are going to live as Syrians, we are not going to live as Christians or Sunnis or Alawis. We will not allow the sectarian divide. The same has happened with many Alawi communities.
That tells us a lot about this conflict, because usually it is said that the Assad regime is an Alawite regime, which means that in the end it's a fight between the Alawites and the rest of the country. But if you look closer, it doesn't seem to be like this.
No, absolutely not. The fact that the regime is Alawi is as relevant to this really as the fact that I am agnostic. This is not a sectarian fight. Sectarianism has been used to further the regime's narrative. In Syria, it does not matter if you're Christian or Druze or Ismaili or Assyrian or Sunni or Shia or Alawi. What matters is that you are Syrian. And today, regardless of your background, if you oppose the Assad regime, you will be targeted. When the regime is launching missile strikes against civilian populations or launching gunfire, the bullets and the missiles are not discriminating. They are not only targeting Sunni areas. The victims are not only Sunni Muslims. The victims are Alawis. We have hundreds of Alawis in jail because they expressed support for the revolution.
We had the latest news that there were grenades hitting Assad's palace in Damascus. This seemed to indicate that the uprising is coming closer to the center of power in Syria. How would you assess the situation in Syria? How strong is Syria and his army really at the moment?
Well, the borders of the liberated areas and the areas held by the regime forces are very fluid. You cannot define an area as definitely liberated, and you cannot define an area as certainly regime held. Even if you go to places like Idlib, I was told that there are still streets in where you have governmental tanks. And let's not forget the armed opposition had already several times very far in Damascus. Once, for example, when they assassinated Asef Shaukat and Dawood Rajiha, the Minister of Defense. And but they are not strong enough to topple the regime. The army of Assad is strong enough not to lose the war, but they're not strong enough to win the war. They have 4,000 battles. It's a question how much they can do they use, and they have the air force. And because Assad does not trust the ground forces, he uses the air force, the airplanes, and the cluster bombs. It is also a question how many foreign experts, pilots, for example, he is using. This is a big question mark. We know there are Iranians on the ground. We know that at least Russian experts are helping in the air defense installations. But I see there is a stalemate on the ground, and unless there is a big bang in case of foreign military intervention, or of a big attack, this stalemate might be overcome. But this situation, as we have it today, might drag on for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm. Compared to Syria, Mubarak in Egypt was toppled very easily, Ben Ali in Tunisia as well. And even in Libya, it was easier to get rid of Gaddafi. Why is it so difficult to get rid of Assad in Syria? What is different in Syria?
Well, there are structural differences between Libya and Syria and also Egypt. Egypt, the army is a popular army. The generals never would have been able to move the army against the people. The army in Syria has to protect the regime. Be the Alawite regime or be not the Alawite regime, they have to protect the regime. A second big difference is in Libya, neither in Libya nor in Egypt, you had an institution as the Shabiha, which brings the terror on the streets. And then, of course, the civil population defends itself. A third major difference, and I'm sure Ms. Jouejati will contradict me, is that in Syria, Assad has more people supporting him than Egyptians supported Mubarak. There are maybe 20% of the populations who benefited from the regime and who are afraid of revenge. And there is a silent majority who does not take up sides because they do not want to be crushed between these two. And so, well, there are structural differences and of course, and also the ethno-sectarian wounds Syria has, the Kurds always having been excluded, the downward trend of the Sunnis, the invisibility of the Shiites, and the persecution, non-existence of the public non-existence of the Palestinians. So you have a lot of conflicts which had been a taboo and which are now openly debated. I would like to see that there is no sectarian hatred, but sectarian hatred had become a part of the public discourse.
Do you really disagree with what Dr. Hermann said?
Of course I disagree.
That's good.
In terms of the comparison to other revolutions, what we have at play, I do agree with you on a couple of points. Fear is a huge factor. Now, from the beginning of the revolution, we saw soldiers defecting from the regime's army, and they defected because they refused to fire on unarmed civilians. Very simple. And what we saw was that those defectors were immediately executed. The regime was very clever in having two sets of troops. You had the forward troops who would fire on people, and in the event that they did not, the rear troops would fire on those soldiers. So defecting became almost an exercise in suicide. So it's been very, very difficult for the Free Syrian Army to amass the kinds of numbers we would need to confront the regime. In Mubarak's case, you know, the army, the armed forces basically went to Hosni Mubarak and accepted his resignation. And this was very neat and clear, and they lost 800 people in the course of the protests, but compared to Assad, Mubarak was a small kitten. So fear, I think, is among the primary factors. Yes, we do have the Shabiha problem. The Shabiha are not just Alawi, by the way. The Shabiha are paid thugs. They can be of any religious denomination or ethnic background in Syria. They are allowed to kill and harass with impunity. There is no law that regulates the Shabiha. There is no accountability. For many of the senior politicians or diplomats or media personalities who would defect, they must secure the safe passage of their families before they can announce a defection. Sometimes you're talking about extended families, so 30, 40, 50 people must go. When Riyad Hijab defected, he had to plan it for 3 months. In fact, he was sworn in as prime minister as he was planning his defection. I know a very prominent member of the Damascus Chamber of Commerce who went to Lebanon, and he received a message. If you defect, we will send you your family in small boxes. So this has been a primary issue.
Rafif Jouejati, you say that there will be no solution in Syria until Assad is deposed. That brings us to the question, what has to happen that Syria can get rid of Assad?
My hope would be that Assad would be taken out from within his inner circle. We know there are tensions within the family, the ruling family. We know there are tensions within his immediate gang, and so this would be one scenario. Another scenario would be that the Free Syrian Army finally does reach the palace. Today they missed, but they could keep trying. So the hope would be that Assad would go from within. Another option would be that he will finally take up different calls for him to simply disappear and take exile in perhaps Russia or some other nation that is supporting him. I think these are the two scenarios. I don't believe he will step down willingly and admit that the revolution has been successful.
If you consider all these scenarios, which one do you consider to be the most realistic one?
Well, I do not expect Assad to step down. I do not expect him also to be assassinated because, well, the inner circle around him is getting smaller and smaller. His brother Maher is crippled. The mother and the sister Bushra are living now in Dubai. The brother-in-law, Asif Shaukat, is killed. And to my knowledge, it's let's say, Iranian elite units who are protecting him because he does not trust even now family members. So he's trusting now the Iranians. The inner circle is getting smaller. On the other hand, Assad is having a father complex. He was always considered to be the weak guy within the family. Basil, the elder brother, who he killed himself in a car accident in 1994, was charismatic and was a strong leader. Bashar always was considered to be weak, and now he wants to show, I'm up to my father. What my father gave me, what I inherited from my father, I will defend. What my father succeeded in 1982, I will do today. And therefore, I do not expect that he will step down by himself. The only way to make him step down is that the Russians change sides. But let's be frank, what can we offer the Russians, we as the West, that they change sides? We can't them offer anything. That means, well, we have to live with this situation. There had been the discussion of Farouk al-Shar'a, the vice president, as this so-called Yemeni model. But as soon as it was proclaimed by the Arab League in January as the Yemeni model, it was the death kiss for Farouk al-Shar'a, and no Syrian wants to be compared to the Yemenis. So also this is not necessarily the case. I still recommend, don't do it with Assad, but do it with the regime. Don't do the mistakes the Americans did in 2003 in Iraq by trying to destroy the regimes and tearing the country into a long civil war. Try to bring in some people from the regime you think you can work with, because later on you have to govern to rule the country. They have the experience.
We don't have a problem with this. In fact, there are many discussions with regime officials, many of whom are silent defectors. They simply cannot announce their defection. One of the biggest mistakes in Iraq was that the United States really destroyed all institutions and immediately dismantled the Ba'ath Party. We are not calling for an immediate de-Baathification. We're calling for a gradual transition and transformation. The other thing is we would want to retain regime officials who do not have blood on their hands. We recognize that we must keep the lights on in Syria. We must keep some semblance of a country when Assad is done destroying as much as he can. And so regime officials who don't have blood on their hands are perfectly acceptable. But in the Western narrative, when they say political solution, or when Russia says political solution, they want members of the opposition to sit down with Bashar al-Assad and include him in any sort of transitional process. And this is completely unacceptable to us.
There's a lot of talk about military intervention. The Turkish newspaper Milliyet reported that the US and Turkey are thinking about having missiles, Patriot missiles at the Turkish border to realize something like a no-fly zone. Is a military intervention by the international community or by the West alone, is that a real option?
You know, some days it seems to be a real option, like today when Turkey requests NATO assistance because the Assad regime is firing into Turkish territory. Other days, members of key Western nations say that military options are not on the table. Military intervention may be one of the only ways to stop the bloodshed in Syria. Certainly many Syrians are asking for military intervention, whether it's in the form of a no-fly zone or equipping the Free Syrian Army with anti-aircraft equipment so that they can shoot down the attack helicopters and the MiGs. The LCC has always asked for humanitarian corridors to ensure safe passage of supplies, and this is a modified sort of military intervention.
But you're supporting a military intervention from abroad.
I support a well-thought-out military intervention that ensures that the true Free Syrian Army, not the Salafists, not the imported jihadists, that ensures that the defectors from the regime are able to defend civilian communities. I am afraid that the imposition of a no-fly zone would lead to more casualties than the Assad regime can create. And if that is the case, of course I don't want that. Again, I go back to saying I think the best case scenario would be a collapse from within, and I think this is happening gradually. I think we'll have to see what comes of the ongoing border issues with Turkey.
Should the international community talk about a no-fly zone, for example, or is there a danger if we have something like a military intervention? Is there a danger that the whole region is going to explode, that we have a spillover to Lebanon, that we even might have a spillover to Israel?
The spillover is already and will increase from day to day. But let's come back to the military intervention. I'm very skeptical that it will happen, unless the circumstances, the conditions change, for two reasons. One is there is no appetite in Western countries, in NATO countries, because let's be frank, who is asking for a military intervention has to send his children or grandchildren to the war, and in Germany at least no political party would dare to support such a project. And the same is true for the United States. Just observe what President Obama did and what he will do the next year. He evades. He's getting as far as possible from the Middle East and the Middle Eastern problem, and is talking not about China and Pacific and so on. The second reason is, even if you start to implement a no-fly zone, you have to attack or to get the the air defense of the Syrian air defense into your plannings and your preparations. The Russians have installed the Syrian air defense system just because of preventing an international military intervention. That means if we start a military intervention, we have to deal then with the Russians. How will the Russians? They saw this is the far spillover, but of course we have a small spillover. In Iraq, for example, the Iraqi Shiites, if you go to Najaf, the Wall Street Journal had a very nice story on that. It was not nice, but it was good information, showing how Shiites from the Sadrist group in Najaf were being sent to Iraq, to Syria, to fight with the Shabiha, to fight with the regular army. Then if you go to Anbar, to the Sunni province, there's also an organization to send Sunni fighters to support the armed opposition. You have to spill over to Turkey, because the Syrian National Council had the seat in Istanbul, but Turkey is fighting the Kurdish insurgents, the PKK, and therefore the Kurds mistrusted, also for other reasons, the armed opposition being supported by the Turks. There is a spillover on the Alawi Sunni, the Kurdish Turkish front to Turkey. You have, of course, well, it doesn't need any explanations, to Lebanon. I am very pessimistic because I neither see a military solution nor a political solution. It will drag on. The spillovers will increase. And 100 years after two Western politicians, Sykes and Picot, drew the borderlines of the Middle East and created states which never had been before, these borders become irrelevant because the states become irrelevant. And this is the fear I have, that we live in a state of statelessness, of lawlessness, which might prove the fear of Lakhdar Brahimi that this will become a Somalia very close to Europe.
Do you agree with this, with what Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN envoy, said, that Syria could turn into a second Somalia?
May I tell you a very quick anecdote about Lakhdar Brahimi?
Please.
I met with him in New York just after the Friends of Syria meeting there. And I was trying to relay to him, because it is my job to do so, what student protesters were saying in Damascus. They held big banners and they were marching down the streets of Damascus, and they said, "Welcome to Syria, Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, on your mission impossible. Why did you not send us Tom Cruise?" So these are students who presumably the next day will be arrested or killed, and they were able to maintain a sense of humor. Mr. Brahimi was so offended by this, he would not let me speak again. And I tried to say, but you must hear the voices of the people in the streets. You cannot be a neutral party and not know what is being said. And he completely dismissed me. So I think Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi is well past his time. He should perhaps write his memoirs. I believe that he took a failed Annan plan and tried to repackage it. And so I believe this is very lazy diplomacy. It is very easy to dismiss an entire nation as being simply another Somalia or Sudan and then wash your hands away from it. Absolutely not.
What the role of the United Nations should be then?
I don't know that the United Nations has been able to play any sort of effective role in many conflicts, and so perhaps this is a different debate. But clearly the United Nations has not done anything here, and in particular, Mr. Brahimi.
But in the end, I mean, if you look at the situation on the ground, I mean, you have divided opposition. You have something like local militias. You have the Kurdish in the north. I mean, how can you be sure that the whole country is not going to fall apart if we have such a stalemate as we have it now in Syria?
I cannot be sure, but I stay very positive. And the reason I stay positive is because, as I said from the beginning, Syrians by nature are peaceful and they are secular. Syrians are fighting for freedom. You still have peaceful protests every day. And as long as those activists are willing to go out and face bombs and bullets and demand what? Freedom, dignity, democracy, then we have to stay optimistic. We know for sure that Assad will not agree to any political solution. We know that he is losing more and more soldiers. We know morale is very low among the regime forces. And we know that the people, despite all of the horror and the atrocities, continue to go out and demand their rights. So I cannot be too pessimistic. I think it's going to be a long problem. The post-Assad phase will be difficult, but I believe in the end the people will succeed.
So, please.
These are the real heroes of Syria, and
Yes.
I hope that one day they will govern the country, and
Absolutely.
and we are proud of them. I still have to look on the ground. For example, Homs. There are 3 different big coalitions of armed opposition who do not cooperate, who do not coordinate their actions. The Salafis have Katibat al-Liwa, Katibat al-Ansar. The Free Syrian Army have Katibat al-Farouk. And then there are the military councils, which are called Ittihad al-Thuwar. So why, if we all want Assad to go, if we all want to have a new Syria, why even in Homs they are not able to come together and they have 3 competing military councils?
So let me address this. As this revolution is going on, more and more of the military councils are forming unified battalions or brigades. We have a code of conduct orchestrated by the local coordination committees that has been signed by more than 40 different battalions. The code of conduct is based on the Geneva Conventions and international laws treating the taking of prisoners, fair trials, etc., international laws. We have different parts of the FSA now taking up headquarters in Idlib in northern Syria in what we call the liberated zones until they are assaulted by air. We have much more coordination at this point. We are receiving much more sophisticated communications equipment, that non-lethal assistance that the United States has been promising. So different battalions can now communicate together, whereas they could not before. Certainly, we still have a lot of work to do, but I believe we are coming together. I don't even want to discuss the Islamists because I think they have no role in a transition to democracy.
Hopefully.
No.
Before we start with Q&A, I don't know what time exactly it is now because I can't see the clock from here.
8:07.
Because of the light. But before we start with the Q&A, I just want to ask you a question and please you to have a short answer. What will come after violence in Syria? What will come after the toppling of Assad? Will we see something like a democratic development in Syria?
A period of chaos followed by a transition to democratic development.
Why are you so optimistic about this?
Because we have lost too many people who have been fighting for this. And this is the nature of our revolution, and it is time for Syrians to be done with single-party regime, and it is time for Assad to give up the family playground.
Rainer Hermann, what is your outlook?
In principle, I agree, but my outlook is long-term, very, very long-term. I think Syria will pass through a period of sorrow, of bloodshed, but in the long term, I'm also always optimistic. I'm always in the long term optimistic.
That's good. So now it's the turn of the audience. You are asked to ask questions, and I would like to ask you to really ask questions, if you do so, and not to give an own speech. I know sometimes people like this, but if you're trying to do so, I will go to interrupt you and ask you for the question you would like to ask. And I also would like to ask you, before you start, to tell us your name, please, and what you're doing. So now it's your turn. Please, over here. Just wait for the microphone.
40 years, Syria, 4 months, Hamburg. I just came here. So my question is very clearly, how do you think that you represent the Syrian people? Because I think that you are educated abroad, that you have, since your childhood, you have been outside the country, and as far I can consider my friends, my relatives, they don't like anybody. I mean, this is not personally, but just they don't like anybody which try to rule or just to tell us what we have to do or not what we have to do. I just want to say one sentence for this situation for the people which are not with the revolution and which are not for Assad, because I think this is the main population of Syria, and nobody remembers them when we sit without electricity, without water, and this is not only the regime who dismantled fabrics or canals or anything. And by the way, if the government came in, I come from Latakia, Lazakia, okay? So when government came to Latakia, to the so-called disordered area, well, they disrupted power, disrupted, as you said, but also they pull out the whole population to the sports city. You maybe somebody knows that. So they also try, in a way, to protect the civilians.
Thank you.
Back
Thank
to
you
my
very
question.
Much. Thank you very much for your question. I think we have got your question. I would like to collect some more questions. So if there are any more questions, I can't see so much actually here. Someone far behind, please.
Should I do it in English or in German?
As you like it. We have a translation.
Okay, maybe it's better in English
and in
for
German.
me. Ich komme auch aus Syrien.
Just hold on a second, because Rafif has to put on another headset.
My German's not that good. My English is excellent.
Yeah.
So go ahead, I think.
Okay. Ich komme auch aus Syrien. Der Herr ist Herr Hermann. Ich weiß nicht, ob Sie von der Stadt bezahlt bekommen, dass Sie solche Sachen sagen über Syrien, was gar nicht der Wahrheit entsprechend sind. Sie erwähnen Sachen, was eigentlich, wenn man halt Nachrichten anguckt, beziehungsweise egal im Internet, welche Seite öffnet, gar nicht der Wahrheit entsprechend sind. Behauptungen, was Sie jetzt so sagen über eventuell, was in Haula passiert ist, das sind eventuell Sachen, was gar nicht mit dem Freien Syrischen Armee zu tun hat, und Sie behaupten, dass Sie Gerüchte gehört haben, dass vielleicht nicht die Regierung sein konnte. Letzte Woche bekomme ich als Beispiel eine Nachricht von Familie, dass ein Kind von Verwandten von Scharfschützen erschossen oder getötet wurde. Das können nur halt von Militär, was eigentlich angeblich ein Militär tun. Die Freien Syrische Armee tut nicht die eigene Bevölkerung. Im Gegenteil, die unterstützen ihre Bevölkerung. Von daher würde ich eigentlich sagen, dass Sie so Ihre Meinung, was Sie dazu sagen, was gar nicht der Wahrheit entsprechend sind. Ganz einfach.
Ja. Also Ihre Frage ist nochmal zu Hula. Sind es Gerüchte aus Hula, die von Rainer Hermann verbreitet werden? Ich würde gerne noch, I would like to collect a third question, please. Because I've seen more people. Please, here in the first row.
My name is Stefan Rosini. I'm from GIGA, German Institute of Global and Area Studies. I think the tragic of Syria today is that the government regards the opposition as terrorists, and the opposition regards the government as criminals. And as you said, and as the government says, both are not willing to negotiate with each other. So my question is, to both of you, do you see any possibility to break this? And something like 3 months ago, some analysts and also politicians, they suggested to compare Syria to Lebanon and to take the Taif agreement of Lebanon as a role model for Syria for a transitional period, to give the different communities guaranteed powers so that none of the communities is threatened to get exterminated. Every community would get a certain part of the power. And then in a second and third step, this was the plan of Taif in Lebanon, which was never implemented, to overcome the Taifiyya, to overcome the sectarianism of the country and to build up a modern state with citizenship. So how do you regard the chances of such a model?
I would like to start with this question.
Start with this one?
Please.
And go backwards, because I do want to address
Yes,
the
of
ladies'
course.
concerns.
Yes, of course.
So Lebanon is not a role model for us. The Taif agreement was never implemented, and proportional representation often has an unintended consequence. What we have done in Syria, I have been involved in the planning of a transitional framework that is called the Day After Project, supported also by the German Institute for Security and Political Affairs. And what we have called for is some representation across the board, and we have called for a transition in which all Syrians are equal under the rule of law. So we, I believe, in this report have done a pretty good job, always to evolve, of addressing the representation of minorities and not minorities. One of the areas I am particularly concerned about is the role of women, whether they are Christian or Muslim or Alawi or whatever, but role of women in the future Syria, and so this has been one of my areas of focus. You asked if there's a possibility to break the cycle of terrorist versus criminal. At the beginning of the uprising in Syria, Bashar al-Assad called our people germs and said that he needed to cleanse Syria of these germs. He later said we were all armed gangs or Islamic terrorists. Do I look like an armed gang or an Islamic terrorist? And this will go back to the lady's question of how I represent Syrians. I don't know that there is a way to break that cycle. It's become a propaganda war. But the bottom line is the opposition does not have barrel bombs. The opposition does not have MiGs. The opposition has no way to conduct aerial assaults on civilian communities. And so to me, that is an answer. And I don't know if Dr. Hermann has anything else.
You were also asked the question, do you have anything to add?
Well, first to this gentleman back there, you will be relieved that I tell you that I'm only paid by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, not by the Syrian state. And I would be relieved if you would accept the reports that contradict your personal opinion. The second is how to break this cycle of accusations and distrust. I think the main point to restart Syria is locally, to pacify locally, to make from warlords peace lords on the local area. You cannot pacify Syria with a stroke. But this leads us to the question, what is done today in the liberated areas? There are many reports, mainly by Turkish journalists who slip over the border and who report how these liberated areas are organized. There is a vacuum of state institutions. State stopped to function there. They do not have funds. There is no police. There's no safety. There are no courts. And so they start Sharia courts. I'm not afraid of Sharia because I know that Sharia is a legal instrument which is very, very flexible. You can do everything with Sharia, and it's not correct that when you say Sharia that what's practiced in Iran or Saudi Arabia comes to your mind. But you have to start on a very locally limited area when you want to reconstruct Syria and its institutions.
May I just add two words to this? This is actually being done in many parts of what we call the liberated areas where local councils have formed. There is a cooperation and collaboration between civilian and military councils. In some cases, they are looking at the Sharia to guide them because for them it is a legal framework. In other areas, it is a purely secular movement. But I think you're absolutely right. We must start with local governance and self-empowerment and capacity building.
We still have the third question. Yes, it's a general problem of especially of the SNC, that it is said all these people are Syrians living abroad for a long time. You yourself, you were born in the US, you grew up in the US. How can you represent the Syrian people?
Yes, it's not easy to represent the Syrian people, and I have not claimed to represent all of the Syrian people. The Syrian people are roughly 22 million, and we know that if you get 4 Syrians in the room, you may have 8 opinions. So please, I'm under no illusion. I was born and raised in the United States. I was born to a career Syrian diplomat who served Syria from independence from the French until his death under the regime of Bashar al-Assad. My father was a senior ambassador. I have lived in Syria both as a child and as an adult. I have worked in Syria for state media. I know Bashar al-Assad personally and have met with him on many occasions before he became the president. I grew up with many of the children of regime officials. So I understand the system. I understand the culture. I am Syrian. And I understand what works and doesn't work. With regard to representation, I was requested by the local coordination committees to serve as their spokesperson. When the SNC was formed, I was instrumental in helping them get their media office together. One of the things that hampered their ability was an inability to use multiple languages, even though many had lived in exile for many years. So I helped them with that. I am supportive of any initiative that leads Syria to a true democracy that is not under a brutal dictatorship. And if this is not enough for you, I'm sorry.
There was another interesting point mentioned in the first statement, that there is something like a silent majority in Syria, neither supporting Assad nor supporting the uprising. Do we really have such a silent majority? Well,
the last time I've been in Syria was in June, and this is now 5-6 months ago. There is, of course, many people who do not want to be dragged in any kind of politics, who just want to have a decent life, want to be in business, want to have a good education for their children, and have been, at the time I was in the last time in Syria, are afraid of living in a failed state. Today we are living in Syria is a failed state, of course. So the question I would research on is what these people who claim to be the silent majority, what do they think today? But of course, they had been, I think it really had been a majority at that time.
I think it was a majority at one point. I think you're absolutely right. I believe when the regime started the aerial assaults, that silent majority shrunk significantly because Syrians who don't want to be involved, who simply want to have a good life and to go to work, and are impacted by the daily news of bombing civilian areas. When the attacks were limited to bullets, people could turn a blind eye. Now that it is aerial assault, it's an entirely different picture. We know that much of the infrastructure of Syria has been destroyed, And so many Syrians who were at one time silent are now seeing their entire country getting blown to bits. And this is not what they want.
I would like to ask you for more questions, please. Who would like? Over there, please. Someone raising his hand.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Philip Lina. I would like to thank the panel for the very interesting discussion. My question would be about the general sentiment within Syria for what they would expect from the international community. I feel that we have been focusing a lot on what Syria is doing and what they could do better. What's the expectation towards the international community, and to what extent? I mean, we heard there's certain non-lethal deliveries that have been made, and it's also been part of the presidential campaign over the last couple of months. What are the expectations, and what should be done or could be done? Thank you.
Over here, please.
My name is Härte. I have a question about the impact the situation in Syria has on Lebanon and on Jordan, and what influence the Iran has on the situation. That's my question.
Since we're running out of time, I would like to collect 2 more questions, please. Yeah, please.
Oops.
Ja, vielen Dank für die Informationen an Sie beide. Ich habe bitte eine Frage. Ich habe Probleme bis jetzt zu verstehen, um Syrien, um die Wahrheit zu wissen. Geht es, dass die Syrer aufgestanden plötzlich und sagen, ab morgen wollen wir Demokratie mit Waffen haben? Oder geht das darum, weil Syrien der verlängerte Arm für Iran, dass Israel das nicht duldet für den Fall? Dass wir wirklich mal wissen, um was es geht. Und wenn die Dame grundsätzlich ausschließt, dass man mit der Opposition handelt und spricht, dann ist das eine Schande eigentlich für jeden Menschen, der Blut vergießen kann und meidet es dann die Verbrechen, die syrische Armee, die geht nicht mit Kanonen, da muss sie warten, in 3 Wochen gibt kein Syrer, wenn die nur einfach auf die Menschen ohne Grund so schießen. Das kann nicht sein.
Würden Sie noch mal sagen, was konkret Ihre Frage
konkret
ist?
Meine Frage, was geht es um Syrien und um was von Grund eigentlich, dass diese Unruhe in Syrien? Geht es um Demokratie oder geht es um ausländische Mächte, dass Saudi-Arabien zum Beispiel 240 Milliarden für die Aufständischen bis jetzt ausgegeben hat?
Yeah, my name is Anna Sunik, also from the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, and I have a question. You talked a lot about what comes after Assad, and since you've always also been on the program the day after, I would like to know a more concrete picture. What exactly is the model for a Syria after Assad? I know you talked about a true democracy where everybody is equal before the law, but I think that's still a bit vague. Can you elaborate whether there's a concrete plan on a representational system, whether it will be federal or it will be centralized, presidential, parliamentary, stuff like that? Is there other plans that concrete so you can really say there is a roadmap to a true democracy, whatever that means?
I would like to keep these questions for the very last moment because I think it can give us an outlook to the future. So let's start with a question, Rafif Jouejati. What are you expecting from the international community?
Perhaps my Syrian friend can also give her perspective later, but many Syrians inside have lost faith in the international community. They say nobody came to rescue them while Assad was committing crimes against humanity. Some are fiercely against any form of international intervention. Many are demanding a no-fly zone. Still others are demanding Stinger missiles. Again, you have a large population. Some 15 million people of the 22 million are nearing destitution, and so their options are running out. I can only ask what I am tasked with asking, and my personal views are simply that. The LCC is asking for humanitarian corridors so that we can save people from starving to death, so that we can provide medical relief to those who have been wounded, so that we can support those children who have been orphaned by this issue.
The second question was the impact on Lebanon and Jordan. How do you assess the impact?
One more sentence on the expectation, because I think the Syrian expectations towards the international community were just unrealistic, because they themselves did not do the homework. Let's say that they did not lay the basis so that the international community could act. The consequences on Jordan and Lebanon, well, we see, for example, on one hand with the refugees. The United Nations expects that in the fourth quarter of this year, the number of refugees from Syria to neighboring countries will double again to 700,000, and this will not be the end. And well, most of them, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and at the end of the year, 250 to 300,000 refugees will be in Jordan. So, well, this is these massive flows of refugees are threatening statehoods. Just what kind of discussions do we have in Germany if 1,000 or 2,000 people from all over the world come to ask for asylum? And there are 300,000 just coming within a couple of months. So this puts the Jordan state at risk. In Lebanon, we had recently the assassination of a very important intelligence officer, Wissam al-Hassan, who was very close to the Hariri family and was investigating on what Syria does in Lebanon. So he was assassinated. Another sign of how Syria, or how the regime exports its violence to neighboring countries. And if I might just go on with Iran or not?
Yeah, please.
The currency reserves of the Central Bank of Syria are depleting by amount of, let's say, $500 million per month. That means mainly because of the European sanctions, which are very effective, since we do not buy any more oil from Syria. And Syria had revenues of about $4 billion, which were used then to pay salaries. And now they are not anymore able to pay salaries, and which also creates then new animosities. And Iran wants to move into that and is transferring hard currency to Syria. But now also Iran is getting, in Iran, hard currencies are getting scarce, because the oil production went down from 2.4 million barrels per day to below 1 million. On the other hand, the Basij are training the Shabiha militias. The Pastoran are giving technical help and also logistical help to the regular Syrian army. And there are nearly on a daily basis accounts that the armed opposition or the rebels have caught 12, 16 Iranians who are not pilgrims, but who are part of the military machines.
They're pilgrims with military IDs.
There was the question, what's it all about? Is it all about democracy for Syria, or is it about foreign powers trying to influence and trying to rule Syria?
Well, at this point, I think so many nations have competing interests in Syria that it looks very, very confusing. At its essence, this revolution is about freedom, dignity, and democracy. This revolution did not simply start on March 18th of 2011. Several years before that, a 17-year-old was arrested for blogging, and she was charged several years later with an attempt to undermine the morale of the state, to sow sectarian strife, and she was also accused of collaborating with foreign enemies. This has been a security state for more than 42 years, and people are sick of it. Just as in Tunisia, Bouazizi, and several other peddlers set themselves on fire out of frustration. We are seeing an Arab Spring sweep through nations that are sick of dictatorship. And so that is really what it is about. Certainly there are competing foreign agendas. There are competing groups within Syria, but we cannot forget the basis of our revolution. And we have to transition to a democracy for that cause.
Could you give us a more concrete picture of what will Syria look like after Assad has fallen down?
So my crystal ball doesn't always work so well. What I have been involved in personally in the day after is for us to address 6 subjects. And what we have done is not a blueprint. We cannot tell the Syrian people this and this and this will happen. We can only make recommendations. We have treated the subjects of transitional justice, security sector reform, rule of law, economic restructuring and social policy, constitutional design, and electoral systems. Was that 6? That was 6, right? In each of these areas, we have developed recommendations for the transitional government. And so we expect that if they take these recommendations, we can start making gradual changes in a post-Assad, no-Assad regime to bring about these noble principles of democracy with regard to whether it's going to be a republic, if it's going to be headed by a president or a parliament. We have not made any recommendations about this. We all have our own thoughts about how Syria should be governed, but we are leaving this to the transitional government. We've provided different scenarios. We have learned from lessons from other countries transitioning, not just in the Arab world, but also in Latin and South America, in Europe, in Eastern Europe. Germany and the reunification of Germany was a big lesson for many aspects of our report. So to give you a very specific plan, I cannot do that. But what I can say is that many, many of us are working to support a transitional government so that we can respond to Western demands, so that we can respond to Syrian demands to be finally liberated.
You would like to add something?
Yes. Yeah? Well, what is at stake is a very legitimate question because the country is devastated. The people are demoralized. The economy is ruined. And I have to say bluntly, the meltdown has started and the downward spiral. So we have to ask, what is at stake? One is really, it's freedom. It's not democracy, it's freedom. And this is the national issue. And there I would remind that the regime has started a national dialogue process, which was just for public relations, but gave the opportunity to Farouk Shar'a, the vice president, to give a remarkable speech in which he said, the end of the one-party regime has come to an end, and we have to abolish Article 8 of the Constitution. And from that moment on, he was marginalized by the regime. Secondly, on the international level, of course, the topic is containment of Iran. It's a big alliance, a great alliance, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, to contain Iran. And therefore, Saudi Arabia is active because everyone knows if Syria is taken out of the hand of Iran, Iran will not have any more leverage on the Arab world.
Yeah.
Rafif Jouejati, Rainer Hermann, thank you very much for this discussion tonight here, and I think you should give them a hand.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a rather optimistic outlook of Ms. Jouejati, and I hope you're right. And we have a rather pessimistic outlook of Mr. Hermann, and I think he's right, although I
we hope he's wrong.
I hope he's wrong. Thank you very much. And before we let you go, I would like to ask Ms. Müller to come at the stage to give us some last words.
Wir sind am Ende einer sehr spannenden Diskussion angelangt. Auch von unserer Seite nochmal ein ganz herzliches Dankeschön an alle 3 Akteure hier auf der Bühne. Ihnen vielen herzlichen Dank für Ihre engagierten Fragen. Ich weiß nicht, wie es Ihnen geht, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Für mich hat diese Veranstaltung fast noch mehr Fragen aufgeworfen, als sie Antworten gegeben hat. Eines ist sicher, es gibt keine einfachen Lösungen, keine schnellen Lösungen beim Thema Syrien. Wir hier bei der Körber-Stiftung werden auf jeden Fall gemeinsam mit unserem Kooperationspartner für diese Veranstaltung heute, der Deutsch-Arabischen Freundschaftsgesellschaft, uns weiterhin intensiv mit diesem Thema beschäftigen. Ich darf Sie jetzt wie immer ganz herzlich einladen, noch ein bisschen bei uns zu bleiben und die Themen, die wir hier auf der Bühne diskutiert haben, bei einem Glas Wein noch zu vertiefen. Ich wünsche Ihnen schon jetzt einen schönen Abend und ich freue mich, Sie alle hoffentlich bald wiederzusehen hier bei uns im KörberForum. Vielen Dank.